The best radio, as far as I'm concerned, is the type you're listening to, and you're so into it, you feel so connected to it, that you pull into your driveway, shut off the ignition of the car, and then click it back on because you're afraid you're going to miss something.
Welcome back to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and our interview with Gary Theroux continues. Now, last time, Gary was discussing updating the history of rock and roll radio documentary with Bill Drake. Now, Gary, tell us more about this update to the history of rock and roll.
So I came into Bill's company, which is Drake Chenault, and I was given a copy of the 1969 script, which had impressed me so much, and as a kid. And I started flipping through the pages, and I couldn't believe how awful the script was. It was not only chaotically arranged, but it was packed with errors, which is understandable, because in the late 60s, although Rolling Stone magazine started in 67 in San Francisco, it was really only covering the local scene. There was no serious rock journalism at that time. There were teen magazines like Flip and 16 and stuff, but most of the stuff in there was garbage written by publicity departments. But no real serious rock journalism existed. So when the folks at KHJ had to cobble this thing together, they had to work with the best materials they had, which weren't particularly good. So I went back to Drake and said, would you mind if I basically rebuilt this thing from scratch? And he goes, oh, would you? So I basically jettisoned everything in the KHJ history of rock and roll except for one sequence, which is called the Phil Spector listening test, where different records were played for Phil Spector, and he commented on them. But the rest of the show, I dumped. And I brought in hundreds of artist and hitmaker interviews that I'd done over the years, and we recorded a whole bunch more. And I also organized the show into themes so that each hour of the show had a particular theme to it, or a half hour. So it actually has made some sense, and put things in chronological order, and wanted as much as possible to have the actual people who created the music be the ones to tell the story, rather than a narrator droning on.
Yeah.
And we went through several potential narrators. I wanted Humble Harv to come back, and he was interested, but I was told that he was verboten because Humble Harv had a problem with his wife. While he was on the air, she was often cheating on him. And he decided one day to pre-record his show and surprise her at home. And he did, her and her boyfriend. And shots rang out, and Humble Harv went to prison over that.
That's right, yeah.
And so we auditioned several people, and we were getting close to the point where we really had to start recording narration. And I finally said to Bill, look, you've been doing these station IDs for Drake Chenault, WXXX in Las Vegas, or whatever it is. And I said, why don't you narrate it? And he says, oh, I was waiting for someone to ask. So I wrote the show following his speech pattern so that it would be easy for him to maximize his effectiveness as an announcer and come up with something that was compelling and captivating. And it worked.
Wow. And
so we expanded the history of rock and roll to 52 hours and released it in 1978, and it ran on over 900 radio stations around the world, and it won Billboard's Top Special Program of the Year award, which was kind of neat. And Bill and I remained friends, pretty close friends, for the rest of his life. And along along the way, I acquired the trademark rights to the history of rock and roll. And so although I've done other things in the intervening years, like I spent 20 years as the music and entertainment editor of Reader's Digest, putting together box sets of all kinds of music, all different eras, I finally decided to take advantage of the fact that I do own the trademark and revive the history of rock and roll, but not as a long special, but instead as a weekly 2-hour series. And I was involved with an outfit called the Hit Parade Hall of Fame, which included Bill Drake and also a guy named Wink Martindale.
Oh, yes, the Winker.
Right. And I was told that Wink was looking for a project. And I had put together several Christmas box sets, for example, for Reader's Digest, one of which, Christmas Through the Years, sold over 11 million copies, making it one of the largest selling box sets ever released by any label. And I wanted to turn that into a radio special. And I was told by the Reader's Digest marketing department, oh, we don't do that. So I said, well, okay. But I hung on to the idea. So after I left Reader's Digest, I asked Wink, what do you think about the idea of putting together a 12-hour or 10-hour or some length Christmas special and call it the 100 Greatest Christmas Hits of All Time? And it would include the stories behind the songs, tons of artist interviews, and could be a lot of fun. And he said, that sounds like a great idea. So we put that together, and it debuted over KRLA in Los Angeles, and it became quite a success. And we have been doing variations on that, revising it every year since then.
That's great. How long have you been doing that for?
Let's see. I guess it's been about 14 years.
That's great. It's interesting you mentioned that because Wink Martindale was on KHJ. In fact, that was his first radio station in Los Angeles when we moved from Tennessee. However, when he was on KHJ, it was a middle-of-the-road station called Radio 93. It oftentimes had the format of the month club. While KHJ Channel 9 was a success, KHJ Radio 930 was not so much until Boss Radio came around. But then in 1960, about a year after Wink came to L.A., KHJ and KRLA, which was top 40, did a switch or a trade of their morning men. So KHJ got KRLA morning man Perry Allen, who was he didn't like rock and roll anyway. So, and Wink, since he debuted Elvis on television, gladly switched places, and Wink became the new morning man on KRLA. He did that for about 2 years. He had the Wink Awake Club, and then he went to Dot Records for a while to be the vice president. And then after that, he was on KFWB Channel 98 for about 5 years, close toward the end of its being a music format.
I actually was on KRLA myself after leaving Drake Chenault.
That's right. You were on KRLA Hit Radio 11. Now, Art LeBeau was program director at the time, I think. And you had other DJs there, including Johnny Hayes, Mike Horn, Jack the Hitman Roth. What did you do at KRLA?
Well, among other things, when I arrived at KRLA, Johnny Hayes was hosting the Noontime Countdown, which consists of 15 or 16 of the current hits that the station was playing. And they could be in any order. And I said, well, this is bogus, and this is an oldie station, so why are we playing up current hits? If we're going to do a noontime countdown, we're the big 11, so let's make it 11 tracks, and we'll play the 11 top hits on this date in some other year. It could be 1960, it could be 1975, it could be some year. And to do that, I drove down to the Billboard offices on Sunset and went into their archives and started pulling up old charts and copied down like the top 15 because I wasn't sure I was able to get all of them. But by that time, I had amassed an enormous record library, which I still have, And I was able to find almost all of these tracks, a good number of which radio had completely forgotten about. So I completely rebuilt the Big 11 Countdown with Johnny Hayes, and I scripted it for him, so he would tell the stories behind each one of these hits. And again, L.A. was hearing tracks that many, in a lot of cases, hadn't been heard in Los Angeles for eons. And the end result was that the Noontime Countdown shot KRLA to number one.
Wow.
And I was told by my friends at KRLA, the other oldie station in town, that what they would do at noontime is they'd go out in their hot, steaming cars, turn on KRLA, and eat their lunch in their cars, listening to this countdown.
That's amazing. See, the thing is that was my frustration. One of the reasons I got into radio is to play oldies. But by the 90s, the oldie stations were basically the same 101 oldies over and over again.
Right.
KRLA did a better variety of music, but still, even then, they weren't playing what they could have played. And a couple months ago, I interviewed Gary Mora, who was a DJ in San Francisco, and he's recreated the KYA 1260 up there. Yeah. And so I've been listening to that online, and I'm hearing stuff I've not heard on radio in years. Like they were playing Bluebird by the Buffalo Springfield. Now, granted, Buffalo Springfield was a one-hit wonder nationwide, but regionally in L.A. and San Francisco, they had a bunch of top 40 hits. So it's really cool to hear them actually playing stuff from the charts themselves and going off the charts rather than just playing what was nationally the top 10.
Well, of course, once upon a time, most radio stations were locally owned and locally programmed by people who were very much in tune with local audiences. And they had request lines, and they had their DJs out with the public. But then along came deregulation and large station groups, because at that point you could only own a limited number of radio television stations.
That's right.
Period. Yeah. But once deregulation came along, you could own as many as you wanted. And so big conglomerates came along and ate up all these local radio stations. And the localness, which is the number one asset that a radio station has, was completely lost. And what they did instead was impose one-size-fits-all, but not really fitting anywhere perfectly, new formats. Mm-hmm. And they also tried to eliminate the idea of personalities. Now, of course, Bill Drake was a charter member of this movement because he became frustrated in the early 60s with a lot of DJs who really loved listening to their own voices. Mm-hmm. And they were so much stars unto themselves that if you went into their studios, you'd find a lot of the 45s they were playing had the labels painted over because they didn't want another DJ to walk into the studio and discover what songs they were playing. Oh. And this is frustrating also for station owners because if a DJ in a local market became too big, they could walk in and say, hey, I want my salary doubled or I'm going to go to their other radio station across town. And Bill Drake was aware of this, so he decided to invent the Boss Radio Much More Music format, where the emphasis was on the radio station and its overall sound, and the DJs could express their personalities, but only as long as there was a talk-up at the beginning of the song.
Oh.
And so a lot of really wonderfully inventive DJs got driven out of the market, really creative people, but also a lot of people who were just bozos, who, when people actually wanted them to play the hits, they would rattle on instead. So there are pluses and minuses to that. But what happened in the industry after that, particularly after deregulation, was the idea of cutting down the air personalities to the absolute minimum. Maybe even having them pre-recorded doing liners rather than actually communicating with the audience. And the end result of that was that no longer was the DJ you're listening to on the radio, that invisible friend in the car who has interesting things to say and great music to play. And a given hour of a radio station's format would consist of 4 quarters, all of which sounded exactly the same. And you knew that you could tune out for 5 minutes or 5 days or 5 years and not miss a thing. Mm-hmm. The best radio, as far as I'm concerned, is the type you're listening to, and you're so into it, you feel so connected to it, that you pull into your driveway, shut off the ignition of the car, and then click it back on because you're afraid you're going to miss something.
Yeah. Did you ever read the book Radio Waves, Life and the Revolution of the FM Band by Jim Ladd by chance?
I'd heard about the book, but I've never actually seen a copy of it.
Yeah, it's a really good book. I'd recommend it because, granted, it talks about freeform FM rock, but it also discusses how the Mighty Met KMET was the main focus of the book here in Southern California, 94.7, which for the last 37 years has been called the Wave, which started off as desk chair music for yuppies, like new age contemporary, and now it's smooth R&B. But KMET really was kind of Big Daddy Tom Donahue's radio baby in Southern California, while KSAN was his station up in the Bay Area. And Ladd talks about his own career and how he got into it. He talked about how ABC radio networks decided to go from the Love Radio freeform to Rock and Stereo, which was kind of like a top 40 rotation for rock, and took away the freeform that he got into radio for, and then decided to go to KMET, and for many years it was number one. But then come the early 80s when New Wave was big and K-Rock came along here in LA and played the New Wave, it was suddenly number one in 18 to 25, while the Mighty Met was still number one, but only in 25 to 54. And so the management panicked and said, well, let's hire a consultant. And Jim Ladd said, the consultant will just help the program director. Well, Ladd said the first thing the consultant did was he robbed the record library, made it 10% of what it was. And then 2 weeks later, basically the consultant took over the programming. The PD was PD in name only. And that's pretty much what killed the station. And they kept on having program director after program director, each with an idea worse than the next. And so it kind of reminds me of that and stuff. So it's really cool that you got Wink Martindale, because he's got a variety of interviews. I mean, he's got a huge library. How much of his interviews do you use for the current history of rock and roll?
Well, Wink sent me a list of the interviews that he conducted while he was in Southern California. I would say there's probably about 30 names on the list, all really good studio quality stuff, and Wink being a really great interviewer. Because some people doing interviews, it's so understand you got some songs, like what ones, that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. But Wink actually knew this and knew what to ask and knew how to get great answers out of the people he interviewed and become good friends with all of them. And that certainly shows. But the bulk of the interviews in the history of rock and roll, our current series, actually are ones that I've conducted or collected over the last 40 years.
This is the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. We're talking with Gary Theroux. He's a radio personality, author, educator, Emmy-nominated, also the producer and proprietor of the History of Rock and Roll. And next time we find out who he got to interview recently for the show, as he's added to the variety of interviews that the program has, plus a great story about meeting singer Dionne Warwick.